Right, the first power tool that we're going to look at today is the chop saw. And before we use a chop saw, there are certain safety checks that we need to carry out to make sure that we're not going to injure ourselves or anybody else. So the first thing to bear in mind is your PPE. Always you need ear defenders and eye protection as you work in the chop saw. I'm just going to put these down for a moment. And at times you might need a dust mask as well. It depends on the sort of materials that you're cutting. If you're cutting hardwoods or if you're cutting MDF, you'll need a dust mask as well as your eye protection and ear defenders. We're just going to be cutting some softwood today, and we're hooked up to a hoover. We've got local dust extraction, which is also very good practice for the workshop or when you're working in your own shed. So we should be all right without the dust mask today. So having made sure that we've got that covered, the PPE, your own personal protection, we also need to check out the chop saw itself and make sure it's fit for purpose. So everything should work. The cables should be tidy. It's not a tripping hazard. There should be no bare cables showing, and the guards should all be functioning properly. The blade needs to be sharp and not damaged. So from time to time, if this is your own chop saw, you'd examine the blade and make sure there's no chipped teeth or anything like that. So we're going to have a look at this chop saw. Everything seems to be in good order. It's securely fixed to a bench. It's got its dust extraction hooked up. All the guards are undamaged and working properly. What I'm going to do, I'm going to unplug the chop saw before I do anything to it, and then I'm going to make sure, with the chop saw not running, that the guards are working. This machine has a lever here to release the guard and allow you to cut down. What should happen, if I just push down, this chop saw won't chop. I need to release the guard release so that the guard works as it should. So that's the first fail-safe. If you could just push that down without releasing the guard, then there's something wrong with the machinery and you need to take it to a professional to have it repaired. We've also got a dead man switch, a thumb switch. So in order to fire this up, if it was plugged in, I can't just pull the trigger. I need to have my thumb on the thumb switch before I can pull the trigger. And again, if that trigger works without the thumb switch depressed, then there's something wrong and it needs to be repaired. Okay, so these are all the sorts of checks that you need to do before you use the chop saw at all. Everything's nice and solid. The action is nice and smooth. It's not sticking anywhere. It's not full of debris, little old bits of wood and sawdust. So this is good to go. I'm just going to check as well that my angle set is nice and smooth. I can move that from 45 degrees to a 90-degree cut, right round to 45 degrees on this side, and that's all nice and smooth, nothing sticking there. No surprises once I start using this in action. We've also got a bevel cut. I'm just going to take the dust extraction hose off so I've got access to this lever. This is the bevel lock lever. So if I move that guard out of the way, I can also set the bevels, and again that's nice and smooth and tight. There's not too much slop in that. So, and once I squeeze that up on zero on there, which gives me a 90-degree cut, everything's nice and solid. So I'm happy with that. That's all good to go. Before I use it though, there's a couple of things that I need to be aware of about how I use the machine. The most important is this no hands area here. So you can see it's nice and clearly marked out. You've got a picture of a hand and a big red line through it. That's telling you your hands don't go anywhere this side of the line while you're cutting. You might think that you're safe here, but sometimes wood can get loose, it can kick out, and your hands can be drawn in to the cut, and you can do a lot of damage very, very quickly. So your hands stay either side of this line. This guard for a straight up and down 90-degree cut, that fits over there. And most machines will have something like this. The setup will be roughly the same. They'll have these even if it's not this particular make, it'll have similar guards, similar warnings about where to put your hands. So we've checked the machine out, we've got the right PPE on, and now we're ready to make a cut. So I've got my pencil mark here that I'm going to cut to. What I'll do, with everything switched off, I'm going to take that plug out. It's always good practice to make sure, as you're making any adjustments, that not only is everything switched off, that your plug's out. It's a nice visual guide so you can see that you're safe. And what I will do is line up my timber with the edge of the blade. I've got my hands in the no hand zone and I'm ready to make that cut. So I'll plug everything in. Glasses on, ear defenders on, and my machine. So we wait for the machine to stop, and you notice that what I did was a nice gentle cut. One of the things that you get wrong with a chop saw is cutting too fast. It's the term chop saw is a little bit misleading. You should stroke it gently through the wood, otherwise you get a lot of tear out and your cuts aren't accurate and it's not so safe either. So a nice gentle cut, and that should give us a perfectly square edge, exactly on our line. So what if you want to cut a piece of wood that's too short for you to hold comfortably outside of the no hand zone? Well, this piece of wood fits exactly that criteria. Really, that 30-40 millimeters that's got outside of the no hand zone isn't enough for me to get a firm grip. So I'm not happy with cutting that piece of wood. In some cases, you just call that scrap and put it in the scrap bin. If you're working with good quality timber, you might want to use that. And most saws will come with one of these. You've got a hold down or a hold fast. This one just drops in there. We tighten up the thumb screw and then drop the hold fast onto the top of that rod. Tighten that one up, and then using a little bit of scrap to protect your wood, we can tighten everything up so we don't need any hands to hold the timber as we make our cut. Okay, so you'll notice that we've got a graded scale, graded in degrees around the front of our chop saw. Most chop saws will have this, and it allows us to make angled cuts all the way from 45 degrees to 90 degrees, all the way back to 45. This one goes up to about 50 degrees on the other extremity. So we can do all sorts of cuts like picture framing cuts, skirtings, architraves, things like that with our chop saw. How we do that is we unscrew this locking nut, push down with our thumb on the locating pin and move it round to the angle that we want. Most of the more common angles, just take that out of the way so you can see it, most of the more common angles like 45 degrees, 30 degrees, 22.5 degrees will have a positive location, so it'll click into place. In between there you might have to line things up yourself and then just tighten up the locking screw here. So we'll do a 45 degree cut. We'll move that all the way around to here, clicks into 45 degrees. Good practice, even though it's clicked into that locator. For accurate work, just tighten that up so there's no movement at all. With the machine switched off, just do a test, make sure that everything goes all the way up and down. That's no problem, there's nothing getting in our way. Put our piece of wood in place, I put my PPE back on. Switch on my machine and my dust extraction. Hand well out the way and I make the cut. The other function that we have is the beveled cut. So if we're looking at moving the saw in this plane, that's our angles. In this plane, that's our bevels. So I'm going to take the dust extraction out of the way, undo the locking nut, and I'm going to also move the guard out of the way here, so that when our saw comes down to here, it's not knocking on the guard, so that's sort of dual purpose. We drop that out of the way and move that down to 30 degrees. So there's a pointer and a scale here. Check that, line it all up, and then lock that up nice and tight. If you're doing a lot of work and you need a very accurate angle or bevel, it's always good to do a practice piece and then check the angle with a protractor, just to make sure you've got the angle you want. There's a little bit of free play on these machines. It's not always perfectly accurate to the degree. So we've got that set up for our bevel. So put my PP on, switch on my machine and my dust extraction, hand well out of the way. And I make the cut. The last thing I'm going to show you using our chop saw is a compound cut where we're doing a bevel and an angle at the same time. So we've left the bevel on 30 degrees. I'm going to move my angle round to 15 degrees, tighten up the locking screw, switch on the machine, dust extraction, and make the cut. So you can see a nice, accurate, compound angle bevel cut. So you can see there's a lot of things that you can do with the chop saw. If you're doing more imaginative joinery with angles and all the more complicated cuts, the chop saw is a really good investment and it's worth buying a good one. So this is the bandsaw. It's a really worthwhile investment for the hobby worker. This is probably quite a bit bigger than you might buy for your shed, but something like this or a benchtop bandsaw is something that you'll probably get a lot of use out of and you'll be glad you bought it. So how does it work? What's it for? Well, you'll see, if you have a look up here, you can see we've got a selection of blades carefully put out of the way where they're not going to hurt anybody or get damaged themselves. And we've got fine blades and coarser blades, we've got narrow blades and quite thick blades. And as you can imagine, the narrow fine blades are very useful for doing fine curved work in thin material. The wider blades, such as the one that we have in here, this is a 25mm blade, about the thickest that we can put into this machine. Because of their width, they're very stable and they'll hold a straight cut. So this is good for doing straight work, and that's what we're going to start with. So first of all, I'll take you around the bandsaw a little bit. At this stage, you won't be expected, in fact you won't be allowed to change blades or do any resetting on the bandsaw. You'll ask your tutor or the technician to set up so that you can do the cut while he supervises you making the cut. Just so as you know what's what and how it all goes together, and so you can develop your skills and eventually, maybe if you get your own bandsaw or as you go to higher levels on this course, so that you can start to make the adjustments that you need to make, and so that you can spot if there's anything untoward with the setup of the bandsaw before you use it. It's useful to know what we've got. We have here a thrust bearing which needs to be set fractionally behind the blade, 0.1 millimetre of a gap between this thrust bearing and the blade. If it's too tight or too far back, then you need to talk to your technician or your tutor to get them to reset it. On either side of the blade, we have guide bushes, which again need to be just slightly to either side of the bandsaw blade. 0.1, little over 0.1 millimetre, so just a hair's breadth of a gap between the two, and they stop the blade from shimmying from side to side as it makes the cut, but it shouldn't be in constant contact. So this whole assembly is duplicated underneath. There are two castings like this with thrust bearings and with guide bushes underneath as well, and again that needs to be all set up exactly the same as this top casting. We have height adjustment here, which you are allowed to adjust. That's a locking screw and that's an adjusting screw. Now, for example, if we were cutting this piece of timber, what we would want is our thrust bearings just slightly over the timber, so it's got maximum control. So we've got the maximum stability in that cut. We don't want that right up here. There's a little bit of leeway. For example, if you're doing a curve cut, as I'll be doing later, you might set that just a little bit higher than your piece of work so that you can actually see where you're going, but it wants to be as close as you can comfortably get it and still see what you're doing. So that's where that needs to be, and I'm going to lock that off there. So that's ready to go. We also need to be aware of the fence, which moves this way, and as you can see there, my fence is now sticking on the thrust bearing adjuster. So what I could do is either unlock it, just lift it up so that'll pass underneath and get the adjustment that I need, or we have the option of undoing this screw, sliding that all the way out, sliding it back in here, and then obviously we can, for smaller work, we can drop that right down and still have our fence, keeping our piece of timber moving nice and parallel to the blade. So we also have a dust extraction vent. The gate here needs to be open as the machine's running. We have an isolator there, and your tutor or technician will have the key. Around here you have a stop button, and you have an emergency stop button at the bottom left-hand corner of the machine that's just perfect for you to kick. If anything goes wrong, if you get anything stuck in the machinery, then you can just kick that and the machine will stop within less than 10 seconds. This machine should stop in about 5 seconds. So what we're going to do to demonstrate how we can use the straight cutting facility on our bandsaw, which has an awful lot of uses, which we'll explore as we go through the course. What I'm going to do today is we're going to have a look at another mortise and tenon joint. Now, you've had plenty of practice in cutting these out by hand. Today we're going to use machines and see how that compares. The first thing that we're going to do is cut our tenon, which I've already marked out. It's pretty much exactly the same as the one that we did the other week, except this one is going to go all the way through. The mortise is going to be a through mortise rather than stopped. So how do I cut this on the bandsaw? One thing to bear in mind is that the bandsaw doesn't like you to take a piece of wood back out once you've got halfway into a cut, or if you've got a cut that doesn't go all the way through the wood. In doing this, you can sometimes snag the timber, snag the blade and drag it off its bearings. Obviously we want to avoid that. So, for reasons that will become obvious as you watch the video, we're going to do our shoulder cuts first, and then we're going to do our cheek cuts afterwards. And we're going to do all the cutting so the waste is on this side of the blade, or as much as we possibly can. And I made a little jig to help with those shoulder cuts and keep them square. A bit easier. This is a very, very simple jig that I just made a few minutes ago to help me to cut my shoulder cuts. So what I'm going to do is slide this jig along the fence. It gives me a nice parallel cut going this way, and as you can see, if I'm careful, I can do my cuts into the shoulder, and that's going to keep that cut nice and parallel. Might just need to, because of the depth of the jig, I might just need to raise the thrust bearings and guide bushes slightly out of the way. I want my hands as far as possible away from the blade. So obviously this is a fairly safe machine. It's not going at the sort of speeds of our circular saws, but still you can do a lot of damage. The easiest thing to do is perhaps not to be paying attention and maybe have your thumb in the way of the cut. So I want to keep our hands as far away from the blade as we can. And you can see I've already made a cut, and that's made an index mark on this fence running this way. I'm going to line that index mark up with my shoulder cut. I'm going to put my PP on, and I'm going to make the cut. Okay, so we've dispensed with the jig. Now the cheat cuts are even simpler. We just set the fence up so that as we make our cut, this waste piece will drop out away from the blade. So there's no tension on that blade. As we take our tenon piece back out, there's no pressure from those two bits of wood squashing on the blade that's likely to bring it off its guide, out of its guide bushes or off its bearing. So that's a nice safe cut. We could set up a stop on here. If we're doing a lot of work, we probably would clamp a stop so that every time we make a cut, it stops at exactly the same place, just for the sake of speed now, and so you can see what we're doing. I'm going to leave that clamp out of the way and that stop out of the way. I'm just going to do this by eye. So I'm going to cut along until I see the blade lining up with that shoulder cut. So as you can see, it took a little while to get that first cut right, but once that's set up, once you've done your fine adjustment with the machine running, because it's sometimes a little bit of slop on the blade, you can do all your cuts based on that. Initial setup, maybe if you've got 20 or 30 of these, it's all going to be the same dimension from the fence to this outside face. So once that's set up, do all your cuts that way, flip it over, do all the cuts that side, and then just that final adjustment to take this shoulder off here to give your coverage in your mortise. So this is one of the safer tools that we have in the workshops. Again, we're starting with the things that are least likely to do any damage, obviously. And like the bandsaw, this is a relatively safe piece of equipment, but there are hazards associated with it. The main thing to bear in mind as you're using the mortiser is that your work area is clean. The worst thing that's likely to happen to you is that you trip and fall into the cutting surfaces as you're working. So we want a nice tidy work area, and be aware of the people that are around you as well. Make sure that if you're working near someone that's using the mortiser, or any machine for that matter, that you're careful not to bump into them. Be very sensitive to the fact that they're using heavy machinery. So as with everything else in this workshop, our bare minimum PPE is eye protection and ear defenders, and we'd be expected to wear those at all times when we're in here anyway. It's quite a noisy machine. There's not too much splatter, there's not too much debris flying around, but again, eye protection is mandatory while you're using it. You'll notice that it's not hooked up to the dust extraction system. It doesn't create a lot of dust. So that would be difficult to do, and it's not necessary anyway. So the only thing to remember is if you ever were using it to work MDF or any material that has carcinogenic qualities, then you'd use your dust mask. We're cutting softwood today, so there's no problem there. And what we're going to be doing is cutting the mortise for the tenon that we've just cut on the bandsaw. And I'm going to drop it into the machine, into the vise here. You see that we've got a set of chops, a removable wooden vise with a little ledge on it that holds it in exactly the right position for your hollow chisel mortiser. I'm going to squeeze that up nice and tight so it can't move. And we do want this to be good and tight, because as we take the chisel out of the workpiece, it can tend to drag it upwards. So we need a nice tight grip in our vise. So how does this machine work? We've got a lever that brings this hollow chisel down into the timber, and it cuts a square hole, and it does that with the aid of this auger bit that runs inside the hollow chisel. So you've got, if you imagine, a big drill bit inside here, and you've got, which is cutting a circular hole, and then the chisel comes in slightly after. It's just set a couple of millimetres up from the bottom of the auger bit, and that squares that hole off. It works really, really well, and it's a standard piece of equipment right throughout the woodworking industry. A couple of things to bear in mind. This should be set up. It's not up to you at this stage to be setting the machine up. If you're not sure, always check with your technician or your tutor, and obviously before you even touch it, you need to make sure that you are supervised closely as you use the machine. Things to look out for would be maybe the tip of the chisel looking quite blue and burnt. That would suggest that it's not sharp enough, or if it's not perfectly square to the back fence. Another thing to watch out for are these slots here. There's one here, and there's another one just like it on the other side. These are clearance slots, so all the wood chippings that you make as you're drilling your holes come out of these clearance slots, and these need to be set up so they're running parallel with the bed of the machine. So as we move the chisel, we make a hole, and then we move the bed of the machine. So in effect, the chisel is moving this way through the cut, and it's creating a trench behind it, a slot behind it, and that's where all the chippings, all the wood goes out that way. So these need to be that way and that way, not this way. And for usual use, the lower slot is at the edge of the cut that you're moving away from. So if you imagine that chisel moving through a slot this way, leaving a trench behind it, and that slot needs to be on that face, so the wood chippings go into that slot or that trench behind it. Becomes clear as you start to use the machine. So I'm just setting up the cut with the machine switched off and getting the corner of my chisel on the corner of the cutout that I've already marked out, and just as if you were doing it by hand, we're going to set everything up so it's slightly to the waist side of the line, and hopefully we're bisecting the pencil line that we've put on. We'll leave a little bit of pencil line on the good side of the wood with just this side of the waistline. Okay, so that's all set up, that's ready to go. I'm going to switch the machine on. Okay, next bit. So you may have noticed that I didn't go all the way through. If I did that, what would happen is there'd be nasty breakout. That grain would all splinter at the bottom of the cup. So what I need to do now, having gone halfway through that from that side, I'm going to flip her over and finish the cut going through from the other side. So wait till the machine stops running before you make any changes. We can open that, take it out of the vise, and hopefully we should have a perfect fit.